The signal came in at 3:47 in the morning, and nobody was prepared for what it said. I was at my desk in the UNLiaison office in Geneva, working through a stack of translation reports that had been sitting there for 2 days, when the alert tone on my terminal cut through the silence like a blade. The kind of tone that means something has already happened and the world just hasn't caught up yet. I had been a first contact liaison for 11 years, and in all that time, that tone had never meant anything good. It had meant satellite anomalies and atmospheric disturbances, and once, memorably, a coordinated network failure that turned out to be caused by a software patch rolled out in the wrong time zone. But it had never, in 11 years, meant anything that mattered at a global level. Tonight was different. I pulled up the feed and read the message twice. Then I read it a third time, very slowly, because the words did not seem like words that could exist in a real document sent to a real institution by real beings who actually meant them. The Galactic Conclave, representing 41 spacefaring civilizations, hereby notifies the species designate Earth Sol 3 of its formal decommission review. The use of nuclear energy, combined with demonstrated interplanetary ambitions, constitutes a Tier 1 threat under Conclave Expansion Protocol 7. The species designate has 1 solar cycle to comply with the following directives: cease all nuclear energy operations, ground all interplanetary vessels, and submit a formal declaration of civilizational containment. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. I stared at that last line for a long time. Enforcement action. 2 words, doing a tremendous amount of work. I called my director, Alan Price, at his home. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had already seen it. His voice was steady, which was something I had always respected about Alan. He did not panic easily. He was the kind of man who had spent 30 years in international diplomacy and had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in a crisis was raise your voice. I had watched him sit across from heads of state, from military commanders, from negotiators who were actively trying to destabilize the conversation, and I had never seen him blink first. There was something in him that had been forged through decades of watching things go wrong slowly and then all at once, and it had produced in him a quality of steadiness that was not calm exactly, but was something more useful than calm: presence. He was always present in the room. "Yara," he said, "get dressed and come in." "I am dressed," I said. "I never went home." There was a brief pause. "All right, come to the secure floor. We're pulling everyone in." I grabbed my coat and took the stairs 2 at a time. By the time I reached the secure floor, 12 people were already there. The lights were bright and wrong feeling for 4 in the morning. Someone had made coffee, but nobody was drinking it. The room smelled like recycled air and the particular concentration that comes when people who are good at serious work are doing it under serious pressure. The main display showed a live orbital feed, and on that feed, arranged in a formation above the Pacific Ocean at a distance of roughly 40,000 kilometers, were 200 alien ships. They were not trying to hide. I looked at the ships for a long moment and felt something strange happen in my chest. Not fear, not the way I had always imagined fear would feel if this moment ever came. It was something more like a sudden narrowing of the world down to what was essential, the way everything goes very precise and defined when the thing you have been preparing for, that you have been turning over in your mind for years as a theoretical problem, finally arrives and stops being theoretical. I had spent years writing position papers for first contact scenarios. I had argued in conference rooms with people who thought the whole exercise was academic. I had tried to imagine what I would think and feel if the moment arrived. I had not imagined it would feel this clear. The monitoring team had a rough audio component ready. When we played it, the room went very quiet. The voice was not human. It was layered, like 3 voices speaking in near-perfect synchrony, each one fractionally offset from the others in a way that created a texture rather than a sound. And it was calm in a way that made my skin feel tight. Calm in the way that something is calm when it has never had a reason to be anything else, when it has done this specific thing so many times that the question of outcome stopped being interesting long ago, and what remains is only procedure. It said the same words that were in the text, then it added something the text had not included. This notification is a formality. Compliance is expected. No further communication is required from your species until the decommission review is complete. Alan turned the feed off. "They're not asking," said Lieutenant Commander Peter Walsh, who was standing to my left. Peter was from the Defense Liaison Office and had arrived in full uniform, which told me he had been on shift when the signal came in. He had a long, sharp face and a habit of stating obvious things in a tone that made them sound like revelations, as if he believed that saying the obvious thing out loud was a service that not enough people provided. "They came here and gave us an order." "Yes," Alan said. "That is what they did." The room started moving. People were reaching for phones, pulling up secure lines, connecting to capitals, Geneva, to New York, to London, to Beijing, to Nairobi, to Delhi. I watched the room fracture into 12 separate urgent conversations and felt something settle in my chest, a kind of organized focus that sometimes happens when the size of a problem makes everything else irrelevant. Not calm exactly, more like the moment before something breaks, when everything is very still, and the stillness itself tells you something important about what is about to change. I walked to the window. It was dark outside, but the city glowed below in the way that cities do, constant and indifferent to crises. I thought about the 41 species above us, in their 200 ships, waiting for a response from a planet that had never been asked this question before, waiting for us to do what no one before us had apparently refused to do. The assumption in that calm, layered voice was total. It had the quality of something that has never been wrong and has stopped imagining that it could be. Then I thought about something else. I went back to my desk and pulled up the conclave signal again, this time working through the original untranslated version with our decryption key. The translation team had done fast work, and they were good, but fast work sometimes leaves things behind. There is a difference between the first pass through a text and the careful reading, the one where you slow down at every sentence and ask whether the first meaning is the only meaning. I had learned that difference over 11 years of sitting between parties who were trying very hard not to say what they meant, and I had learned it by being wrong about first meanings enough times to take the second reading seriously. I read through the signal twice. On the second pass, I found what I was looking for, in the fourth paragraph, buried under a layer of procedural language so standard that anyone moving quickly would have skipped it without registering that it was there. In cases where the species designate issues a formal response to this notification, said response must be filed through Conclave Protocol 9, the Reciprocal Communication Standard, and will be entered into permanent galactic record. They had to record our response. Whatever we said back, they had to keep it, every word, in every translation, for as long as the conclave maintained its archives. The phrase was permanent galactic record, and in a civilization that had been operating for 900 years, that phrase meant something very specific and very long. I pulled out a notepad, actual paper, which I preferred for first drafts, because paper cannot be hacked and cannot be accidentally sent, and has a weight in the hand that makes you think more carefully before you commit to what you write. And I wrote 3 words. Then I crossed them out and wrote them again, because the first version had a comma in the wrong place, and what goes into a permanent galactic record should not have a comma in the wrong place. We warned you. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket and went to find Alan. He was standing at the center of the room, on the phone with the Secretary General. I waited until there was a pause in the conversation, and then I held up one finger. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has learned, over 3 decades in diplomatic service, exactly what it means when a person he trusts holds up one finger. "Hold on," he said into the phone. He covered the receiver. "What?" I need 5 minutes with you before we draft anything. Yara, I'm talking to the Secretary General. I know. This is about what we say when you're done. He studied me for a moment. The expression on his face moved through several things quickly: impatience, assessment, and then a small shift that I recognized as the moment he decided I was serious in the way that warranted stopping what he was doing. "Give me 4 minutes," he said into the phone. We walked to the corner of the room. I told him what I had found. I told him about the permanent record clause, about the obligation to retain whatever we sent back, about the way the conclave's own protocol created a channel that their founding law required them to take seriously regardless of what they thought of what we put in it. I told him what I thought it meant and why it mattered not just now, but in the long view, the view that stretched past this solar cycle and past our lifetimes into whatever came after. He listened without interrupting, which was how I knew he agreed before I had finished. "You want to send it like that," he said. "Exactly like that. 3 words. 3 words." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Geneva was beginning to lighten at its edges. The first pale suggestion of a morning that was going to be very different from any morning that had come before it. Somewhere above that lightening sky, 200 ships were still holding position, waiting for a species they had already categorized to give them the response they already expected. "They'll think we're being dismissive," he said. "Good." Alan almost smiled. Almost. He was not a man who smiled easily, especially not in rooms with this much pressure in them, but there was something in his eyes that was not quite diplomatic neutrality. It looked, just briefly, like something he would not have named out loud in a professional setting, but that I recognized because I had seen it before in people who had just watched someone do the right thing in exactly the right way. "I'll bring it to the Secretary General," he said. "No promises." "I know," I said, "but make the case, Alan. Tell them it goes into the permanent record. Tell them that in 1,000 years, when whoever comes after us reads that archive, they need to see that we weren't afraid of the question. They need to see that we had already thought about the answer before the question arrived." He nodded once. He went back to the phone. 36 hours later, after consultations across every continent, after heated arguments in 14 languages, after 2 governments temporarily refused to sign and then signed anyway, the response went out. Official. Unanimous. Binding under every protocol the UN had ever established, and several it established specifically for this occasion. "We warned you." The conclave received it, and according to the translation team monitoring their internal communication frequencies, there was a sound that mapped closely to laughter. One of the analysts, a young woman named Claire Dobbs, who had only been with the team for a year, turned in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone trying to decide whether to be offended. "They're laughing at us," she said. "Yes," I said. "Does that bother you?" I looked at the orbital feed. 200 ships, 41 species, 900 years of galactic authority, arranged above one small blue planet that had just sent back 3 words. "No," I said. "Let them laugh. They're laughing because they don't know what those words mean yet." Claire looked back at her screen. Then she quietly wrote something on a sticky note and put it on the edge of her monitor. I couldn't see what it said from where I was standing. Years later, after everything that happened, I asked her what she had written. She said, "They will." The morning the conclave fleet crossed the marker, I had already been awake for 19 hours. That was not unusual. Since the day the signal came in, 6 months ago, sleep had become something I did in 2-hour stretches on the cot in my office, waking up to check feeds and briefings, and the slow, grinding, necessary work of what the world had quietly agreed to call the preparation, not defense, not mobilization, not any of the words that carried the weight of declared intent and might be heard by the ships above. Preparation, neutral, technical, patient, a word that asked nothing of the person hearing it. Words matter, especially when someone might be listening. I was not a soldier. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because what I am about to describe is not a soldier's story, and I am not qualified to tell it as one. I was a liaison officer, a translator, a person whose job was to sit between two parties and make sure neither one misunderstood the other when misunderstanding was the more dangerous outcome. What I know about the engagement, I know from the official record, from the technical debriefs I attended afterward, and from a conversation I had with Staff Sergeant Emeka Adichie 3 weeks after it happened, over 2 cups of bad coffee in a temporary forward base outside Oslo that smelled like industrial soap and cold concrete, and the specific quiet that settles into a place after something very loud has stopped. Emeka was 29 years old and had the kind of steadiness that some people are born with and most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. He had dark, watchful eyes and hands that were very still when he talked, resting flat on the table rather than moving the way hands move when someone is nervous or trying to shape an impression. He had been stationed on Lunar Platform 14 since January, one of 14,000 rail launch platforms embedded in the Moon's surface across 6 operational regions of the lunar landscape, and he described the morning of the engagement in the same measured, factual tone he might use to describe a long and difficult shift at work. Not because it had not mattered to him. I could see clearly that it had mattered enormously. But Emeka was the kind of person who processes intensity by reporting it precisely rather than dramatically, and precision, in someone who has been through something large, is its own form of honesty. It respects the event by not performing it. But I am getting ahead of myself. The 6 months between the conclave's message and the day the fleet moved were the strangest 6 months in human history. Not because things fell apart, because they didn't. I had expected chaos. I think most of us did. The signal had gone public within 12 hours of receipt, not because anyone planned to release it, but because 27 different people in 27 different offices had forwarded it to someone they trusted. That is the thing about trust under pressure. It compresses quickly. Each person who received it sent it to 2 more, and each of those 2 sent it to 2 more, and within a day, every person on Earth with access to a screen knew that 41 alien civilizations had sent us an ultimatum and expected our compliance within 1 solar cycle. And the response from the majority of those 8 billion people was some version of the word no. Not immediately, not in unison, not cleanly or without enormous friction. There were governments that issued official statements of cautious compliance within the first 48 hours, and there were public demonstrations against those statements within 12 hours of them being issued. There were economists who published detailed analyses showing that resistance was economically irrational, and physicists who published equally detailed analyses showing it was militarily impossible. And both sets of analyses went viral on the same day and were argued about on every platform simultaneously, often by the same people who had read both and found themselves landing somewhere in the middle and not knowing what to do with that. The argument went on at every level and in every direction. It was loud and exhausting, and sometimes frightening in its intensity. The specific kind of friction that happens when people who agree on the underlying thing cannot agree on what to call it or how to move toward it. I sat through briefings where military planners argued with diplomatic theorists, who argued with economists, who argued with scientists, and all of them were operating from the same information and arriving at completely different conclusions. And the arguments were so fierce and so detailed that someone who heard only 1 hour of any of them might have concluded that humanity was fundamentally unable to agree on anything at all. But underneath the argument, something else was happening. I watched it from the secure floor in Geneva, where my role had shifted from diplomatic liaison to something closer to a listener with clearance. I was reading everything I could access. Public forums, government communications shared with our office, consulate reports from 43 countries, analysis documents from intelligence services that were being routed through a joint clearinghouse set up in the first week. And in all of it, underneath the noise and the friction and the disagreement, was a current. Quiet, consistent, moving only one direction. The people were saying, "We built all of this ourselves. It took a very long time, and it cost a great deal. We are not going to put it down because something larger told us to." They were not saying it in those words. They were saying it in 100 different forms, in 100 different languages, with varying degrees of anger and fear and resolve present simultaneously. But the shape of the thing was consistent across all of them. The underlying movement was consistent. What shifted the response from feeling into something organized was the document. It came from a team at the European Space Agency, published on a Thursday afternoon, and it was not dramatic in the way that important things are sometimes dramatic. It was a dry technical report, dense with data tables and engineering analysis, that made a single argument in careful, systematic detail. Humanity had been collecting alien material for decades, debris from unmanned probes, microwave emission signatures from passing vessels, signal fragments from the outer boundaries of our system. 80 years of patient accumulation, stored in databases maintained by scientists who were not certain what they were looking for, but were certain it was worth keeping, because that is how science works. You keep the thing you don't understand, because the day you understand it is coming, even if you can't see it yet. The report said that in all of that material, there were patterns, engineering patterns, design signatures, things that could be studied and compared and taken apart and put back together by people who were very good at understanding how things work. And the conclusion of that analysis was not what the conclave expected. The gap between our technology and theirs existed, the report said so plainly, but it was narrower than anyone had projected from the outside. And in specific domains, materials science, kinetic delivery systems, energy-to-mass ratios in certain propulsion applications, we had independently arrived at solutions that matched, or in some cases, exceeded what we could observe in recovered alien engineering. 11 scientists signed the report. 40 million people read it by the end of the following week. After that, the conversation changed, not from fear to fearlessness. Human beings are not fearless, and the ones who claim to be are not usually the ones who show up when it matters. But from fear to something more useful, a specific and practical question about what to do with it. I was in those meetings. I sat at the tables where the question was being answered, watching people who had never agreed on anything in their professional lives find common ground in the narrow, technical, concrete question of what to build and how fast. Arguments that had been going nowhere resolved themselves when they got specific enough. When the theoretical debate continued, the practical work proceeded alongside it. Both were real, and both were happening at the same time, and the people doing the work were not waiting for the debate to finish. The programs already existed. The lunar infrastructure had been growing for 20 years, framed publicly as mining operations and communication relay systems and long-range observation platforms. From above, it would have looked exactly like what a pre-Tier 3 civilization at this stage of development was expected to be doing. The conclave, watching from their position above the Pacific, would have seen exactly what their models predicted, and nothing that contradicted those predictions. In 900 years of conducting decommission reviews, they had never had a reason to look more carefully. No species had ever used the review period to prepare. The review period was, by definition, administrative. A formality. Compliance was expected. That was our advantage. Not technology, not numbers, not any kind of raw capability that could be measured on a chart and compared. Our advantage was the specific and total impossibility, from their perspective, that we would try. 6 months is not a long time to do what was done in those 6 months, and I say that with full knowledge of what it took to do it. 14,000 launch platforms, coordinated across a satellite body with a gravitational field that required constant correction to maintain precision alignment. Targeting systems calibrated for vessel speeds and trajectories that had never been encountered in live conditions, only modeled from the observation data. Training programs running continuously for the personnel who would operate those systems. Because hardware, without trained people, is just hardware. The logistics of supplying and maintaining a lunar operation that was scaling faster than any operation of that kind had ever scaled, across 6 regions, in conditions that made normal supply chain management look simple. It happened anyway, imperfectly, with failure rates that were higher than anyone wanted and lower than anyone had dared to project when the planning began. I asked Emeka once what the training felt like from inside it, whether there was fear during those 6 months. He thought about it for a long time. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands, looking at it rather than at me, while he searched for the accurate answer rather than the easy one. There was a lot of focus, he said. When you are focusing that hard on a specific problem, on the specific procedure in front of you, there isn't much space left for other things to live in. But in the waiting, I said, before the fleet moved. The waiting was hard, he said, simply and without elaboration. I believed him completely. The Conclave fleet crossed the marker at 6:14 in the morning, Pacific time. They crossed in formation. The analysts identified it immediately as standard decommission approach, not a combat formation, an administrative one, the configuration of a fleet conducting a procedure it has conducted many times before and expects to conclude the same way it always concludes. They were not coming to fight, they were coming to close an office. Emeka was at his station on platform 14 when the alert went out. Not an alarm tone, a single low note, 3 seconds, followed by a calm voice. All stations, cross marker confirmed. Begin targeting sequence. The next 4 minutes were precise in the way that deeply rehearsed actions are precise, not mechanical, but committed, past hesitation. The sequence lived in the body before it lived in the thought. Then the authorization came. 14,000 platforms. One coordinated window, calculated to hit the forward elements before the Conclave fleet's targeting systems could identify what was hitting them or where it was coming from. The first exchange was not designed to destroy. It was designed to disable and confuse, to take out navigation and shield systems on the leading vessels and leave the rest of the fleet trying to process an engagement type that did not exist in any of their doctrinal records, because nothing in 900 years had required them to write it. 11 minutes. 67 Conclave vessels disabled or driven back, 4 platforms destroyed by return fire that arrived late and slightly off-bearing, and 1 communications drone named Gerald, a small and unremarkable piece of equipment that the crew of Platform 14 had named for reasons Emeka described as hard to explain, but feeling right at the time, destroyed in the third exchange. The Conclave fleet stopped moving. The silence that followed was what Emeka said he thought about most, afterward. Not the engagement itself, the silence. 14,000 platforms waiting. 133 Conclave ships, still fully operational, sitting completely still at 800,000 kilometers. What were you thinking? I asked. I was thinking about Gerald, he said, which probably sounds strange. It doesn't. We'd had that drone for 2 years. It was just a piece of equipment. But you work alongside something long enough and you stop experiencing it as a thing. You start feeling like it's part of how the work gets done, part of the team. And then it's gone, and that matters, even when everything else that is happening is much larger. He paused. And then I was thinking that they still had 133 ships, and we had no idea what they were going to do next. What did they do? Nothing, he said. For 6 hours, absolutely nothing. The Conclave fleet held position and did not move. They did not fire. They did not advance or retreat. Their internal communication systems were running at full capacity. They were having a conversation we could not hear about something that had apparently never required a conversation before. A pre-Tier 3 species had shot back. Their doctrine had no protocol for it. In 900 years, it had never needed one. I was in the Geneva secure floor when the request came through on the Conclave's formal communication channel. Official, real. Not a threat or a warning, or an administrative notice. They wanted to talk. Alan read it twice. Then he looked at me across the room with an expression that, on a man who had spent 3 decades training himself to show only what he chose to show, amounted to genuine astonishment. "They want to talk," he said. "Good," I said. I reached into my coat pocket and found my notepad. I flipped to a fresh page. There was a clause I had memorized, that 14 legal scholars had reviewed, and all 14 had read the same way. It was time to use it. The conclave's negotiating team arrived in what they called an observation vessel, which differed from a warship in the way that a closed fist held close to your face differs from a punch. The implication was present in both. The distinction was one of stated intent rather than actual capability, and the distinction mattered in the specific way that things which are technically true can matter while still pointing in a single direction. It was also, I thought, as our shuttle approached the docking collar, a deliberate signal. They had chosen this vessel specifically. They wanted us to feel the size of the thing that had agreed to speak with us. It docked with our orbital station at 9:20 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I was on the shuttle up with Alan Price and 4 other members of our negotiating team. The shuttle ride was 40 minutes, and nobody talked much. The woman beside me, Nina Hartwell from the Unlegal Division, spent the whole ride reviewing documents on her tablet with the steady, unhurried speed of someone who has memorized what she is reading and is reviewing it only to confirm that memory has not introduced any errors. Nina was precise and careful in the specific way of people who work with language that carries legal weight, who understand that the difference between a word and a near-equivalent word is not always an academic distinction. On my other side sat Owen Grant from the Science Division. Owen had a quality of stillness that I associated with people whose working lives involve slow processes, geological surveys, deep space observation, the kind of science that trains you to become comfortable with time and to trust that what you are waiting to understand will eventually become visible if you stay patient and keep looking. He had been part of the original team that identified the engineering patterns in the recovered alien debris, and when I had once asked him what that moment of recognition had felt like, he had said, like finding out that the answer to a question you have been sitting with for 20 years was in the room the whole time. You have to sit with that for a while before you can work with it. I thought about that answer a lot, in the months after. Further back in the shuttle sat Harry Cole, our defense analyst, reviewing his own briefing notes with the focused assessment he brought to everything, testing whatever he planned to say against every version of what might go wrong with it. Harry had been in every planning session and every late-night argument about doctrine and protocol for 6 months, and he had a quality of evaluation that was useful precisely because he was not easily reassured. If Harry Cole believed something was sound, it was because he had not been able to break it. Priya Das, our xenolinguistic specialist, sat beside Harry. Priya had built the translation system we were running today, 3 years in development, tested in simulation conditions thousands of times, and never in a live negotiation at this level, because there had been no live negotiations at this level to test it in. She knew it the way a builder knows a structure, every compromise, every design choice, every place where the load was heavier than the original specification accounted for. She trusted it. She also knew exactly where to watch for the moments when trust was being tested. I looked out the shuttle window at Earth growing smaller below us. From this altitude, it had already lost its detail, become a shape rather than a place. All color and curve, blue and white, and the green and brown of continents without borders. No evidence from here of the complicated machinery of the last 6 months, the arguments and the planning and the preparation and the grief of losing things and the strange, quiet determination that had somehow held through all of it. Just the planet, looking the way it always looks from this altitude, which is like something worth being careful with. I had a folder on my lap, one document, 47 pages of Galactic Conclave Founding Law, printed on plain paper, with 14 pages of attached legal analysis. Finding the founding law had not required anything dramatic. It had been included in the original signal data, filed in what the translation team initially categorized as administrative boilerplate. Most of the team had skipped past it. I had read it because I had developed a habit early in my career, after the first time the fine print mattered, and I had not read it and found out what that cost, of reading the parts that most people skip. The fine print is usually fine because nothing in it matters. Occasionally, it is fine because it is designed to look unremarkable while carrying the most important thing in the document. The reciprocity clause was in Article 44, in the conclave's oldest formal language, rendered through 6 cross-referenced lexicons and reviewed by 14 legal scholars across 7 countries, all 14 arriving independently at the same reading. It said, "Any species that successfully defends its home system against conclave enforcement action under Protocol 7 shall be granted provisional Tier 2 status upon formal application, including full reciprocal communication rights, observer presence in conclave proceedings, and protection from further enforcement action pending full review." Successful defense. The language was specific and deliberate, not defeat of the fleet, not destruction or routing, or any word that implied the destruction of the other side. Defense, holding the home system against the enforcement action. We had held ours. The clause was unambiguous, and it had been sitting in the founding law for 900 years without being invoked, because every species that had been in a position to need it had been removed from consideration before they could reach the table to invoke it. Until now. The docking took 20 minutes longer than scheduled. An atmosphere reconciliation issue between the station and the observation vessel required adjustments on both sides, and a period of waiting in the airlock corridor with nothing to do. We sat on the bench seating and waited in the way that professionals wait when the outcome matters, quietly, occupying ourselves with small things, keeping the energy contained rather than burning it in the waiting. Alan reviewed his notes one final time. Nina was still on her tablet. Harry sat with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance in his thinking expression. Priya was making margin notations in a hand so small I could never quite read it from a distance, which she said helped her think through the distinctions she needed to hold clearly when the conversation got fast. I sat with my folder in my lap and thought about what I was going to say, and in what order, and what came after that, and how to stay in the conversation rather than ahead of it, and what to do if Vel-Sarath's first position was something we had not anticipated. I had 6 contingency responses prepared. I hoped none of them would be necessary. The airlock opened. I had prepared for the moment of first sight. I had told myself repeatedly in the preceding week that my expectations would be wrong and I should hold them loosely. There is a difference between receiving that instruction and the experience of the moment when the door opens and the thing that was abstract becomes present and real and standing 6 feet from you. The adjustment that is required is not intellectual. It happens below thought. A rapid recalibration at the level where the body processes the world before the mind gets involved, and it happens whether you prepared for it or not. The conclave negotiating team consisted of 7 beings, each representing a different member species, arranged behind their designated primary voice. The primary voice was Vel-Sarath. I had read that name many times in the preceding months, and now I was standing in the same room as the being it belonged to. Vel-Sarath was tall in a way that was structurally complete rather than accidental. The body plan was bilateral in the broad sense, roughly symmetric across a vertical axis, but the proportions required a moment of recalibration to process. Not alarming, simply different in ways that took a moment of conscious adjustment before the eye settled. What struck me most was the quality of attention Vel-Sarath brought to the room. Full presence, the kind that you recognize in people who have trained themselves to be genuinely, completely in the moment they are in, rather than already in the next one. Not performing attention, having it looked, whatever the biological mechanisms behind it, like the same thing it looked like in humans. Velsorath looked at us for a moment before speaking. Then, "You defended," Velsorath said, in the layered three-part voice that I had heard once before, through a recording, and now experienced as a physical fact in the room rather than a sound through a speaker. It was not a question. It was a statement that was also a recognition, the acknowledgement of something that had not been in any prediction. "Yes," I said. "This was not expected." "No," I said. "I imagine it wasn't." There was a pause. The translation system rendered it as a pause, which was one of the things we had specifically built it to do. Silence in a negotiation is not an error in communication. It is communication. Treating it as something to fill is a way of missing what is being said. "You wish to negotiate terms of compliance," Velsorath said. Alan started to speak. I placed my hand flat on the table, not touching him, just placing it there in a way that meant, "Wait." He stopped. "We don't," I said. "We are here to invoke the reciprocity clause." The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when something happens that no one present believed was possible under any realistic set of circumstances. Velsorath was very still. The 6 other members of the conclave team moved in small but visible ways, shifts of posture, changes in the quality of light around the sensory regions, sounds that the translation system worked through and rendered, with medium confidence, as intake of breath. The team had been in this room before, in other decommission negotiations, and none of those negotiations had ever produced a moment like this one. "The reciprocity clause," Velsorath said, "even through the translation system, the phrase had the specific weight of words that have not been said in a very long time. That clause has not been invoked in 900 years. "I know," I said. "No species before us was in a position to invoke it. They were removed from consideration before they could reach this table." I opened the folder and placed the 47 pages in front of Velsorath. Plain paper. I was aware they found paper unusual and had decided this was not a problem I needed to solve. Article 44 of the Founding Charter, the original language, with independent legal analysis from 14 scholars across 7 countries. The clause grants provisional Tier 2 status to any species that successfully defends its home system against enforcement action under Protocol 7. We defended our home system. We are formally applying. Nina placed the application on top. 3 pages, signed by every head of state on Earth, witnessed and notarized under every conclave protocol we had found in the archived founding documents. She placed it with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a movement until it is no longer a rehearsed movement, but simply the movement. Velsorath looked at the documents for a long moment. Then Velsorath looked at me. "You knew about this clause," Velsorath said. "I found it 9 months ago," I said. "It was always there. It was just that no one had needed to look for it before, because no one had survived the review period to use it." "You prepared for this conversation," Velsorath said. "We prepared for everything," I said. "That is what we do." The meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It lasted 11. We did not argue in the sense of raised voices or issued threats. What happened across those 11 hours was more like a very careful unwinding of assumptions, each one examined and set aside. The conclave's legal team, working remotely from the main vessel and connected through secure communication, reviewed the founding charter independently and arrived at the same reading that our scholars had. The clause was real. The language was unambiguous. Every requirement in the application was satisfied. Velsorath called a formal recess at 8 in the evening. During the recess, our team sat in a small observation room attached to the station's main hub. Harry made tea using a portable kit he had brought in his bag, which I found both practical and entirely characteristic of Harry. Priya was reviewing session notes. Owen was looking at the star field through the observation window with his particular quality of stillness, the one that came from years of watching things that moved slowly. "How do you think it's going?" Nina asked. "Exactly as it needs to go," I said. "That is not an answer." It is the only honest one I have right now, I said. The law is on our side. Whether that is sufficient depends on how seriously they take their own law, and I don't know that yet. Nina considered this. I think they take it seriously, she said. Vel-Sarath has not tried to argue that the clause doesn't exist or doesn't apply. They are being very careful. Being careful is not the same as complying, I said. But you're right, that it's a good sign. When we went back in, all 7 members of the conclave team were standing. I stood, our team followed. We faced each other across the table in the recycled air and the bright, neutral light of a station that was, in this moment, the most important room in the world. Vel-Sarath said, "The application has been reviewed. The reciprocity clause applies. Provisional Tier 2 status is granted, pending full conclave ratification within 1 standard rotation." Nina exhaled very quietly beside me, the kind of exhale that contains an enormous amount of compressed time. "We accept the grant," I said, "and we look forward to full ratification." Vel-Sarath held my gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Your species sent a message at the beginning of this process that we found difficult to categorize." "Which message?" 3 words. "We logged it as an error, an incomplete transmission." "It wasn't an error," I said. "No," Vel-Sarath said, and the translation system added a small notation, "Tone classification uncertain." "I understand that now." We took the shuttle back down. Red light grew in the porthole, slow and blue and whole. Nina said quietly, "You knew they would have to accept." "I knew the law required it," I said. "Knowing and counting on are different things." "Were you afraid?" I thought about the airlock opening. I thought about 47 pages of plain paper on a table, and 3 words written twice because the first version had a comma in the wrong place. "Yes," I said, "but being afraid and letting that fear make your decisions are different things." Nina nodded. She turned back to her tablet. I looked out the porthole. The planet filled it completely now, close enough to see the edge of the cloud systems over the Pacific, the same ocean above which 200 ships had once sat in administrative formation, waiting for compliance. We had not complied, and now we were going home. The archive was in a building that did not look like a building. It looked, from the outside, more like a geological formation that had decided to become a structure. Something grown rather than built, its surfaces smooth and continuous in a way that suggested a process over time, rather than a plan, executed all at once. The way coral grows into a shape that no individual builder designed, but that is nonetheless exactly the shape it needed to be. It was located on the conclave's central administrative station, a structure the size of a small moon positioned at a gravitationally stable point between 2 outer planets, and reaching it required 3 separate transit vessels and a security verification process that consumed 4 hours and involved, at one stage, a scan that a conclave technician described as a resonance match. My translator rendered that phrase clearly, and I chose not to spend too much time thinking about what it meant in physical terms. Provisional Tier 2 archive access. Anything filed before the last 200 years, without a separate clearance request. Anything more recent required an application that would take approximately 18 months to process. I had 6 weeks on my access visa. I went to work immediately. The archive was not organized in any way I could recognize at first. The navigation interface required 2 full days to learn well enough to use with any reliability, and there were entire regions of the cataloging system that I could access but not understand well enough to search effectively, which meant learning to triangulate through categories I did understand to find things I was looking for. The archivist assigned to my section was a being from a species called the Cathari, who communicated primarily through a pattern of color changes that moved across the upper portion of their body in sequences that my translation system rendered with varying degrees of confidence and a certainty notation beside each rendering. Low confidence meant I was working from approximation. High confidence meant I was working from something close to meaning. Most of our early interactions were low to medium confidence, and I learned to read the archivist's responses the way you learn to read any communication that is coming through a system that was not designed for either of you, carefully, with the understanding that the first reading might not be the complete one. The archivist was, despite all of this, genuinely helpful. Not warm exactly. Warmth requires a certain kind of mutual recognition that we were still building the tools to achieve, but precise and consistent, which in a place like this, where every document you find can change the meaning of the documents you have already read, is a form of warmth. On the third day, I found the first file. It was listed under enforcement precedent and described a species from a system 200 light-years from Earth. 600 years ago, they had refused the Conclave's decommission notification. The file described their response as unexpectedly coordinated for a pre-Tier 3 civilization. They had built defensive infrastructure. They had organized a response. They had held out for 8 months before the second enforcement action concluded the review. One line at the end of the file: species designate confirmed non-viable following second enforcement action. I read that line 3 times. Then I sat very still for a while in the quiet of the archive, with the ancient infrastructure humming around me at a frequency below what I could consciously hear, but above what I could not feel. And I thought about 11 civilizations that had been in roughly the position we had been in, and none of them were anywhere anymore. I read 10 more files over the following week, working through them methodically in the order the cataloging system made accessible, taking notes by hand in the notebook I had brought, because the archive did not allow personal devices to connect to its network, and I had decided early on that the notebook would be more useful than the tablet in any case. Each file told a version of the same story: receipt of notification, attempted resistance, removal. The specific variables were different in each case: the technology level, the response time, the character of the resistance, whether it was primarily military or diplomatic or some combination, but the shape of the outcome was the same every time. And in each file, embedded in the summary analysis compiled by the Conclave's assessment teams, was the same observation. The species designate lacked internal cohesion during the resistance period. Factional disagreement compromised the defense effort. The species was unable to unify under a coordinated response within the available time frame. Internal cohesion. I noted that phrase the first time I read it and began marking it every subsequent time. By the end of the week, it was marked in 11 separate files, and I had pulled the Conclave's own assessment protocol documents. The internal checklists their evaluation teams used when approaching a new decommission candidate. The checklist was 47 items. 42 of them concerned technology, resources, and observable military infrastructure. 5 items, at the bottom of the list, under a heading that translated roughly as behavioral risk factors, addressed cohesion. And beside each of those 5 items was a notation that appeared in every version of the protocol I could find, in every revision, across 900 years of document history: historically low predictive value. They had concluded, based on their complete historical record, that cohesion was not worth heavily weighting, that it was rare enough among pre-Tier 3 species facing decommission review, and difficult enough to achieve quickly enough to matter within the available time frame, that it was statistically not a significant variable in their risk projections. They had essentially removed it from meaningful consideration. I understood why they had reached this conclusion. The data supported it. Every single species in their historical record had proven it right. Even the civilizations that had technically unified in some partial way had done so incompletely, with significant internal resistance and fragmentation slowing and weakening the response until it could not hold. The pattern had held across 900 years without one exception. Until us. I sat with that fact for a long time across those 6 weeks, turning it over in different ways, looking at it from different angles. Not the military fact of what had happened above the moon, the social fact of what had happened below it, on the planet, during 6 months when 8 billion people were being asked, effectively, whether they were the same people under pressure as they were in ordinary circumstances. The answer, improbably, had been yes, or close enough to yes that the difference had not been decisive. I thought about what that meant. I thought about the arguments, and the friction, and the enormous, grinding noise of the 6 months before the engagement. The governments that refused before they signed, the public debates that went in the wrong direction before they turned, the reports and counter-reports, and the experts who contradicted each other in real time on every platform available. From the outside, from above, from the position of something watching for signs of internal cohesion, it would have looked like exactly what it looked like, a fractious species falling apart under pressure, unable to agree on anything, incapable of presenting a unified response. And underneath all of it, the work continuing. The distinction is important, and I want to be precise about it, because it is the thing the conclave's assessment models could not capture. The noise and the work were not the same thing. The argument and the action were not the same thing. We argue while we act. We debate decisions we have already made. We relitigate things that are settled, loudly and publicly, even as the settled thing is being carried out. The debate does not pause the action. The alarm does not resolve the debate. Both things are real, and both things happen simultaneously, continuously, and what looks from the outside like fragmentation is often, from the inside, the texture of engagement rather than the silence of collapse. For every other species in the conclave's historical record, the argument and the action had been sequential. The disagreement had been a genuine impediment to the coordination, and the coordination had to wait for the disagreement to resolve, or at least quiet, before it could proceed. The assessment models were built on this pattern because the historical record was built on this pattern. The models were accurate for every data point they had ever been built from. We were not that kind of data point. On my 4th week, I found the Scout report. It was filed 43 years ago by a conclave observation mission conducting a standard long-range survey that had passed through our solar system. The observer had documented Earth's technological level, resource use, and interplanetary activity over a monitoring period of approximately 6 months. The report was thorough and professionally produced, the work of someone doing their job carefully. It noted what it was expected to note and categorized what it saw according to the established frameworks. Near the end, under behavioral notes, was a single paragraph. The species designate exhibits an anomalous behavioral pattern not previously documented in pre-Tier 3 civilizations at this developmental stage. Specifically, the species appears to demonstrate increased cooperative output under conditions of external threat. Where most pre-Tier 3 species fragment under pressure, this species shows evidence of the opposite tendency. Threat appears to function as a social binding mechanism, producing temporary but significant increases in coordinated behavior. This trait has not been observed to be durable. Recommend standard decommission approach. I read it 4 times. Then I set the document down and looked at the ceiling of the archive for a while. The ceiling was very high and gave no particular information about what was above it. They had seen it. 43 years ago, a conclave observer had watched us for 6 months and noticed, described accurately, and documented the specific quality that made us different from every other species in their historical record. They had seen the binding under pressure. They had noted the increased coordination. They had measured it against what they knew about how pre-Tier 3 species behaved and concluded, correctly, from within their frame of reference, that it was anomalous. And then they had dismissed it in 5 words, not durable. And that had been the end of it. The observation went into the file. The file went into the archive. The archive continued to accumulate. Nothing changed. I thought about why the observer had concluded it wasn't durable. The reasoning was not unreasonable, given the available data. In every other species they had documented, cooperation under extreme pressure did eventually fray. The urgency eased, or the immediate goal was reached, and the binding that pressure had produced loosened as the pressure decreased, and the old disagreements came back, often stronger for having been suppressed. It was a reliable pattern. The observer had every reason to expect our case to follow the same pattern. What they could not have known, what no 6-month observation period could have revealed, was that our disagreements do not operate the way theirs assumed. They don't accumulate quietly under pressure and then return when the pressure releases. They are always present, always active, running alongside everything we do, including the doing of the thing that the disagreement is about. We don't suppress the argument to enable the action. We argue while we act. The argument is the texture of the process, not an obstacle to it. And because it is always present, it cannot return when the pressure releases. Never left. Not durable. 5 words written 43 years ago by an observer who had done careful, professional work and reached the wrong conclusion from the right evidence, because the model they were using to interpret the evidence was built from a historical record that contained no version of us. The Cathari archivist passed through the room as I sat with this. They paused. There was a color sequence that my translator rendered with medium confidence. "You are processing something significant." "Yes," I said. Another sequence. The translator took longer with this one, and when it came, "This is common in this room." I looked around at the shelves of information extending in every direction, the accumulated record of 900 years of decisions and their outcomes. "I imagine it is," I said. The archivist moved on. On my last day, I assembled the summary. 3 points. The first, the decommission doctrine, applied uniformly, without accounting for behavioral variation between species, had cost the conclave the contributions of 11 civilizations, whose removal was irreversible. This was a practical argument as well as a moral one. The historical record showed, in the development of the conclave's own oldest member species, that diversity of perspective and approach had been the primary driver of the advances that had made the conclave what it was. Removing civilizations before they could integrate produced a loss that the assessment models were not designed to measure, because the models were built to evaluate threats. They had no framework for accounting for what would not exist after the threat was removed. The second, the reciprocity clause existed because someone 900 years ago had understood this, had written it into the founding charter as recognition that a species capable of defending itself was demonstrating, by that very act, a resilience and a capacity worth preserving rather than removing. The third, and shortest, we are here, we read your laws, we prepared, we are asking you to change. I folded the summary into my bag. The administrative station hummed around me, ancient and indifferent and enormous. I took the transit to the docking bay and watched the star field through the window and thought about 5 words. Not durable. 43 years old, sitting in the permanent archive of the Galactic Conclave, waiting to be wrong for as long as archives are kept. I hoped whoever wrote it was paying attention. The Conclave Grand Chamber was the largest enclosed space I had ever been in. It was designed to hold representatives from 41 species simultaneously and had been doing so for 900 years, and in that time it had accumulated a quality of weight that goes beyond what architecture alone can produce. You felt it when you walked in, not the dimensions, though they were extraordinary, but the accumulated presence of 9 centuries of decisions made in this specific room, sitting in the air around you the way barometric pressure sits, felt in the body before it is understood by the mind. The ceiling was far enough above the floor that small clouds formed near it sometimes. The first time I noticed one drifting past an upper window, I thought it was an effect of the lighting system. Then I watched it move and understood that it was simply what happened in a space this large. The building had its own weather, small and slow, and entirely indifferent to the proceedings below. I was in the observer's gallery, which ran along the eastern side of the chamber, at a height of roughly 30 meters. Nina was beside me. Owen was on my other side, below us on the main floor, at the table assigned to the Earth representation, round, made of a material we had spent 3 years trying to identify and eventually stopped trying, positioned on the outer ring of the concentric seating arrangement. Harry Cole and Priya Das sat with the formal delegation. Provisional Tier 2, not at the center, not at the edge. We had been Tier 2 for 3 years, and I want to be honest about what those 3 years had actually been like, because it would be easy to present them as a continuous upward line of progress, and the truth is considerably more jagged than that. The ratification vote had passed 6 months after the archive visit. 8 votes of margin, out of 41. 3 of those 8 species simultaneously abstained from a secondary procedural motion on the same day, which the conclave's own observers assessed as a coordinated symbolic protest. We had full status. We had all the rights and protections that status carried, and those rights were real and legally binding. But we had them in the way that you sometimes have something given reluctantly, correctly, undeniably, with the law entirely on your side, but with a quality in the giving that you could feel in the room every time you entered it. Some species were openly hostile. The Voreth ambassador had walked out of our formal introduction session and filed a complaint alleging our presence violated the spirit of the founding principles. The complaint was reviewed and rejected. The review took 4 months. During those 4 months, 3 other species filed similar complaints in what our legal team assessed as a coordinated effort to occupy our energy and resources on procedural challenges rather than substantive work. We responded through the proper channels every time we did not raise our voices. We did not escalate or retaliate or show that we had noticed the pattern. We answered each challenge methodically, waited for each review to conclude, and were still there when it did. That turned out to be, in itself, a form of argument that we had not planned but that accumulated into something real over time. We were not going away. We had nowhere else to go and no intention of going there. We were going to keep showing up, and eventually the people in this room were going to have to find a way to relate to that fact. Alongside the hostility, there were also 18 species who reached out to our delegation in the first year with the specific quality of uncertainty that belongs to beings who want to ask a question but are not sure whether they are allowed to ask it. Most of them were smaller or newer members, junior civilizations that had found their way into the conclave structure without ever quite feeling that they had arrived at the center of it. They had been here, some of them, for decades or centuries, and they had followed the protocols and taken their places and participated in the proceedings and still felt, in some way they had not articulated, that they were not entirely inside the thing they were formally a part of. They wanted to know how we had managed to hold together, not the technical details, not the legal strategy, though they asked about that too when we had been talking long enough for them to feel comfortable. They wanted to understand the quality of it, how a species with as much internal conflict and disagreement as we demonstrably had managed to produce a coherent response to the kind of pressure that had fragmented every other species it had ever been applied to. I tried to explain it honestly, which was harder than explaining it confidently would have been. I told them it had not been clean, that there had been enormous friction and argument and failure at every level, and that the unity we had presented to the conclave was real, but it was not the absence of disagreement. It was disagreement channeled toward a common direction, and the direction had held because enough people in enough places had decided that the direction was more important than the specific argument about how exactly to get there. I told them that the arguing and the working had happened at the same time, not one after the other, and that from the inside, the arguing felt like engagement rather than collapse. One delegate, from a species called the Talvith, whose name in our translation system rendered as clear-seeing, sat with me for 3 hours in the conclave cafeteria one afternoon and asked questions about human decision-making that were so precise and so genuinely curious that I found myself thinking more carefully about things I had spent years taking for granted. Clear-seeing wanted to know how we held contradictory ideas at the same time without the contradiction destroying the underlying agreement, how we could strongly disagree about something and then cooperate on it anyway, whether the disagreement was real or performed. It was real, I said, all of it. The arguments were genuine. The cooperation was genuine. They were not opposites. At one point, Clear-seeing asked, "Do your people ever agree easily?" I laughed, not a diplomatic laugh, the kind that arrives before you have decided whether it is appropriate. "Sometimes," I said, "but we are suspicious of it when it happens too fast." Clear-seeing processed this and produced a sound that my translator rendered with medium confidence. "That is very strange. I think I understand it." "It is very human," I said. The proposal on the agenda today was the one that had taken 2 years to bring to this point. 2 years of preparation and consultation and revision, small group presentations to individual delegations, rejections and revised arguments, and new presentations to different groups with different concerns, amendments made in direct response to specific objections raised by specific species whose vote we needed, counting and recounting. And finally, when we had 17 committed votes and grounds to believe we could reach 21 with what we knew about the remaining undecided delegations, a formal placement on the agenda, the proposal called for the elimination of the decommission doctrine and its replacement with a mandatory contact and dialogue protocol. Any civilization receiving a Tier 1 threat assessment would receive, instead of an ultimatum and a deadline, a designated conclave liaison team, a 10-year period of formal engagement, and access to conclave knowledge and resources during that period. The goal was integration rather than removal. We had modeled it every way we could think to model it. We had presented the data from the archive, 11 civilizations, the consistent pattern, the cost to the conclave of what had been removed. We had made the legal argument that the reciprocity clause itself was evidence that the founding generation of the conclave had understood the value of civilizations that could defend themselves. We had asked Clear-seeing and 5 other junior delegates to speak on the record about what they believed the conclave had lost through a doctrine of removal, and they had, in the careful and precise language of beings who understood the weight of speaking on the record in this chamber, said what they believed. We had done everything we knew how to do, and then we had brought it to the vote. Vel-Sorath was chairing the session. In 3 years, Vel-Sorath and I had developed a working relationship that I would describe as mutual careful respect, not warmth. Not friendship, which requires a different kind of time and a different kind of trust, but something functional and real, built on the specific foundation of having faced each other across a very high-stakes table and come out of it with a shared understanding of what the other party was and was not willing to do. Vel-Sorath had sponsored our ratification vote at significant political cost within the conclave, and I had acknowledged that publicly in the way that mattered in conclave proceedings. Formally, on the record, in language that would sit in the archive, we had not discussed it again. We did not need to. Vel-Sorath called the chamber to order with the resonance tone. Harry and Priya delivered the main argument. Nina presented the legal framework. I watched from the gallery and thought about the scout report. Not durable. I thought about Gerald the drone. I thought about Claire Dobbs writing something on a sticky note at 4 in the morning in Geneva, while 200 ships held position above the Pacific. The debate lasted 4 hours. It was detailed and sometimes heated, and once, during an exchange between the Vorath ambassador and Harry Cole, that had a quality of escalation that I watched with my hands very still in my lap. Vel-Sorath intervened with a procedural motion that redirected the session so cleanly that I did not understand what had happened until it was already over. I made a note to tell Vel-Sorath at the first appropriate opportunity that I had seen it. Vel-Sorath called the vote. I watched the board. 41 lights, coming in one at a time in seniority order. The first 10 split unevenly. 5 for, 3 against, 2 abstaining. The next cluster ran against us, and something in my chest tightened in the specific way it tightens when you have invested 2 years in something that is now entirely outside your control and in the hands of other people's choices. Then a run our way, then 2 against. The tally moved back and forth like a conversation searching for its conclusion. 24, 17 against, 4 remaining. The 4 genuinely undecided species. We had met with all 4 in the preceding week. We had answered every question they raised. We had made every argument we had. We did not know how they would vote, and there was nothing left to do about it. The first of the 4 voted for. 21, the threshold. The second voted against. Still 21. The third abstained. 21. I watched the 4th light. The Talvith, clear seeing. It held for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then it changed. 22 for, 18 against, 1 abstain. The threshold was 21. Nina's hand was on my arm. I had not noticed her move. I put my hand over hers. Below us on the main floor, Harry and Priya were very still. The kind of stillness that comes after something large and long anticipated finally resolves, and the body takes a moment to understand that the sustained effort it has been organized around is over. The chamber made a sound that I did not have a word for in any language I spoke. 41 different species registering 41 different reactions simultaneously. It lasted 30 seconds before Velsarath brought the resonance tone again. The amendment passes, Velsarath said. The decommission doctrine is hereby suspended, pending replacement by the contact protocol, effective 1 standard rotation from this date. I looked at the ceiling. A small cloud was drifting past an upper window, pale and slow, with no awareness of what had just happened in the room below it. Owen leaned toward me quietly. What do you think Alan would say? I thought about a man in Yorkshire, watching the news with the volume turned down and growing tomatoes in the yard. He would say it's a start, I said. Later, after the session ended and the delegations were filing out of the chamber, a message came through the conclave communication system. From the Talvith, from Clearseeing, it said, "We voted for your proposal because we believe it is correct." A conclave that removes what it does not understand is a conclave that is slowly making itself smaller. We are grateful you came. I opened a reply and wrote, "We are grateful you were listening." I sent it and put the communicator away. On the transit back to the docking station, I sat with the hum of the machinery around me and the old quiet weight of the station outside the window, and I thought about 3 words in the permanent galactic record. I thought about laughter. I thought about 11 minutes over the moon and 4 lost platforms and 1 drone named Gerald, whose loss had mattered to the people who worked alongside it. Not because it was important in any measurable strategic sense, but because they had worked alongside it long enough to stop experiencing it as a thing. I thought about the scout report and 5 words. I thought about Clearseeing asking whether we ever agreed easily, and the laugh that arrived before I decided if it was appropriate. I thought about what it meant that the oldest enforcement policy in 9 centuries of galactic administration had just been suspended. That somewhere ahead of us, in 30 years or 50 or 100, another civilization was going to receive a conclave contact team instead of an ultimatum and a deadline, and they were going to have a chance that 11 previous civilizations had not had. And they would not know that the chance existed because a species on a small planet had refused to comply and then refused to go away. They would not know. That was all right. Most of the important work happens in ways that are not visible to the people it eventually reaches. We were not done. I knew that there was more work ahead than behind, the long, slow work of being new in a very old place, of earning the kind of trust that only time and presence produce, of continuing to show up to rooms where we were not always wanted and doing the work anyway. That was the work. It had always been the work. But the doctrine was suspended. 11 gone, and the 12th standing, and the work beginning of making sure there was no 13th. Not because we were the strongest thing in this galaxy, not because we were the most advanced, or the most ancient, or the most anything that could be measured. Because we had refused, because we had read the fine print, because we had sent 3 words into the permanent record when they expected nothing, and stood our ground when they expected us to fold, and showed up to every session, and answered every challenge, and kept going. Because we are what we are, and what we are, it turned out, was enough. The transit docked. I picked up my bag. Nina was beside me, already moving. "Dinner?" she said. "Yes," I said. We walked out together into the hum of the station, which was old and vast, and had just, today, become something slightly different from what it had been yesterday. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, more than enough. We warned you. And this time, finally, they had listened.